Right, so a few days ago, I uploaded a video talking about some drama between two different podcasts now. They were one podcast together at the point of this all kind of starting. And it was all involving two people in particular. So the first one was Emma Page. Her TikTok account has 16,000 followers. She is the host of the Too Much podcast. We can see the TikTok account right here, 110,000 followers. And the other person you need to be aware of was Chloe Madison, with about 7,500 followers, who is the host of the podcast called Unbothered, with about 500,000 followers on TikTok. Now, the Unbothered podcast used to be the Unhinged Podcast, and it's now been rebranded. Unhinged was Chloe and Emma's podcast together. Now, I'm gonna give the quickest recap possible here, where I will not be able to go into all the details that we spoke about in the last video, because it was a very long video. I will leave a link in the description if you haven't seen it already. I would highly recommend checking out that video first, because some of this stuff might not make sense otherwise. I will do my best throughout whilst we're watching through Chloe's response, which is what we're doing today, to kind of give recaps as to what she's referencing. But yeah, very long story short, Emma and Chloe had a podcast together called Unhinged. Now, that went away. It actually got rebranded to Unbothered, and Emma was no longer part of the podcast. There was a lot of questions being asked, what's happening to the podcast here? Then Emma actually posted on Instagram a very quick video kind of explaining that she's been locked out of her account, to which Chloe actually responded on the podcast, going into a bit more detail of her side of the story. Chloe says, yes, I did lock her out of the account, but she locked me out of the accounts first. Again, there's more to it, but I went into a lot more detail in the last video. Now, the most recent thing that we spoke about in that video was the fact that Emma actually uploaded an episode of her podcast, Too Much, where she went into a lot more detail about her side of the story. Here's a 30-second clip that Emma uploaded to TikTok that kind of gives you an idea, maybe a refresher of what that video was.
2 months since I have been erased from the existence of my own podcast. 2 months since the Unbothered podcast has been operating on my accounts without my consent and without compensating me for my half of the business as a 50-50 partner. I am at a loss, and I am done keeping quiet. There is only one person whose peace my silence is keeping, and it is not mine. Everything I'm about to say comes bearing receipts and is completely factual. This is the account of what actually happened to my podcast, Unhinged.
And that is where we left the video. We saw a lot more of Emma's side of the story, and of course I ended that video by saying it'd be interesting to hear what Chloe's side of the story is, and we now have that. It was uploaded 20 hours ago as I'm recording this right now, and it's on the Unbothered Podcast, Spotify, YouTube. We're gonna watch it on YouTube, and the title on YouTube says, "Don't tell lies about me, and I won't tell truths about you." And we're gonna go through some of the key points here, and like I said, I'm gonna try my best to make sense of what she's referencing, because it might be a direct response to something that Emma has said. You might have forgot, what Emma said, and I'll try to do my best to keep you up to date as to what she's referencing. So the video starts off with Chloe giving her initial overall thoughts.
Pouring your heart into something that you really, really, really believe in, letting someone continuously overstep your boundaries just to keep it going, staying quiet, compromising, tolerating things you know you shouldn't, only to have them secretly start a competing business behind your back, demand you delete everything that you've built, or pay them an outrageous sum of money that is nowhere near rooted in reality. And when that isn't working out for them legally, they then try to completely destroy your reputation.
And then Chloe goes on to say that she's going to give receipts throughout this video and give her side of the story. And the first thing that Chloe specifically addresses is this $5,000 offer. So if you remember in Emma's side of the story, she said there was this big disagreement as to the amount of money that Emma was owed. If Chloe's going to carry on the podcast, Emma believes she should be compensated for her half of the business. In Emma's video, we heard that Chloe's final offer was $5,000, to which Emma said was just completely insulting. And then even went into more detail as to how much the podcast was actually earning, and then used that as a way to say $5,000 is ridiculous for what the podcast was doing. Now, Chloe responds to this and says that the podcast wasn't earning anywhere near the amount that Emma was saying.
I think it's really important to address the financials. I saw a lot of people talking about the fact that my offer, which by the way is confidential settlement information, was low and she deserved more because we were supposedly making $20,000 a month. That is very far from the truth. Here are the realities of what we were making. Unhinged started in June 2023, and it went until January 2025. From those 19 months, we made a total of $69,465.84. In expenses, we had, and this is being generous because this isn't including Ubers to and from the studio, food, dinner, all those things surrounding shoot dates, $19,490.30. So total profits made from June 2023 to January 2025 were $43,565.84. Split between two people, that's $21,782.92 over the span of 19 months. That is before taxes. My after-tax take-home was $12,786.57. If you're looking at that as an average monthly pay, that is $672.98 a month.
Okay, so you can see two very different sides of the story as to how much they were actually earning. Now, obviously, there's no real way for us to know 100% what the truth is here. I will say, even bearing in mind these numbers, if we're talking about a business here, and if we're saying that this is a 50-50 split, now, Chloe has very different opinions as to whether this was a 50-50 company or not. Obviously, Emma believes it was. But hypothetically, if we're saying it was a 50-50 company, I still think $5,000 is pretty low, like, to take 50% of that business from, like, the co-host. Like, the company probably wouldn't be valued at $10,000. I'd imagine it'd be valued at more, right? But either way, there's clearly a big disagreement on the numbers here. Now, I'd be interested to hear what Emma's response to this is, because obviously when Emma was talking about this, she was saying, like, we were quoting brands like $8,000 a brand deal. And speaking of brands, Chloe responds to that specifically and says we only ever had 3 different brand deals and some of them were reoccurring.
The entire time that we had Unhinged, we were only able to lock in 3 brand deals. They were longer term and they had very high deliverables, and they happened to fall one after the other in the summer of 2024. So it gave the illusion of consistent success. That summer, through the end of the year, we engaged with more than 60 brands to try to pitch ourselves for deals. And while some of them were interested and we came close, we were not able to lock any more brand deals in. That is all of the money that we made together.
And then Chloe goes on to talk about the money that was earned from TikTok. Obviously, they had an account with over 500,000 followers, and she says that the money was still pretty low there.
So then you might be thinking, well, what about TikTok? They must have made a lot of money off of TikTok, right? There was 1 month where we each made over $1,000 from TikTok, and that was $1,858.73 to be exact. The rest of the time, feel free to look at these screenshots, we each brought home a couple $100s a month off of TikTok.
Chloe goes on to say that she believes her offer was fair, and then mentions what Emma wanted in exchange for her half of the company, which was $250,000.
So what she was offered for the deal was 15% of net revenue of any brand deals that I entered into for the entire quarter, 50% of the next 3 brand deals that I entered into, keep in mind we had only ever done 3 together, or a lump sum of $5,000. And in my opinion, I felt like almost half of my entire take home of what I made on something I worked on for almost 2 years seems fair. And if you want to know what she asked for a total of $250,000. Where is that coming from? I don't know. I don't know. I wish we had that kind of money. We don't.
Yeah, I will say that was a bit shocking to me when I heard that. Like, $250,000 does seem like a crazy amount of money. And again, it's kind of impossible to know, like, what the company would be valued at. But when we're bearing in mind everything that we have seen publicly from both sides of the story, it does seem like that number is pretty high. But then I also think $5,000 is pretty low. So I don't know what the correct numbers is. Obviously, we would need to see all the financials to be able to know that, right? And also, it wouldn't be someone like me who would come up with that number, right? I am not smart enough to work that out properly. Now, this is where Chloe goes on to talk about her relationship with Emma. And if you remember, when we looked at Chloe's first podcast kind of talking about this, she said that Emma did something that was like disrespectful to her, something that Chloe didn't like, felt like she was owed an apology and didn't get that apology. Now, it was pretty vague in that video. We didn't really hear what it was about. We hear some more details here. Like I said, Chloe goes into more detail about their relationship.
The way that I was treated in general was really concerning to my friends, to my family, to my boyfriend. I was constantly being snapped at, yelled at, called names. I was accused of gaslighting her. Anytime I expressed something that made me feel uncomfortable or upset, I was shifted into being the bad guy. I felt like I was always walking on eggshells, and I never knew when I was going to do something that was going to upset her. And if I communicated that to her, that was a whole other ordeal.
We then see an email that Chloe had sent Emma after some incident happened.
I say, the first thing I'd like to address is jumping to conclusions and lashing out with anger. I feel that far before there is any time for a miscommunication to be resolved, I'm stonewalled and met with anger from you. It feels like you're set in your ways about whatever has happened with no room for talking any issues out, leaving me to shove down how I feel and move on if I want peace to resume. The first time I ever tried to confront you with something I was unhappy with, I was met with that. It did not set a great precedent. The next day, you asked to reschedule hours before filming and blew up my phone with texts and calls. I was immensely disappointed and uncomfortable to find out it was because you were creating space in your day just in case name redacted, texted you and decided to get you a blade to the Hamptons. She basically made it seem like an emergency that we needed to reschedule our filming, and it was because she needed to open up her day in case the guy that she was seeing got her a helicopter to the Hamptons.
Oh, okay. Must be nice. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think I would actually trust a helicopter anyways, but I mean, can you imagine being at a place in life where you can just like order a helicopter up to somewhere? Now, looking further at this email, it's Chloe expressing her thoughts, right? And saying things like, my next concern is regarding empathy, and saying that Emma doesn't seem to have much empathy in certain situations, like when Chloe was moving house and she was exhausted. But then Chloe goes on to talk about what the final straw was for her and Emma's relationship and where it kind of just went downhill from there.
The final straw for me was that we were filming and we got a notification that a brand wanted to do a deal with us. We were super excited. It wound up falling through. We ran outside to film it. It had to be done that day. They wanted us to do the suspect trend on TikTok, if you remember what that is. And so that entailed us running alongside each other filming. She kept telling me to get closer to her face, and I was already like this close to her face in the framing. And I was like, I don't think you're going to like it or that it'll work. Let me show you the framing from here and from here. She made a big reaction, a heavy sigh, started catching an attitude. And I was like, we really don't have to do this if you don't want to. You seem like you're not really in the mood. She said, I would be fine doing it if you weren't such a bitch. I said, whoa, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. We have a professional working relationship, and I am not going to be treated like that by someone who's supposed to be my friend, by someone who I'm working with, or by anybody in my life. And I'm going to have to set a boundary now.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that is what Chloe was referencing in the podcast when she said something happened and she didn't receive an apology. And in fact, Chloe actually goes on to say that that was the final time that she saw Emma, was after that incident. And then we start hearing more of the timeline of like Emma saying she's leaving the podcast to then like these big disputes over like the ownership and whatnot that we heard a lot about in the last video. Chloe goes on to show that Emma said that she's leaving the podcast and that the podcast cannot go on without her, so Chloe gets a lawyer.
I wanted a plan in place. When I do hear back from her, she tells me that the podcast cannot exist without her. And so then I'm like, all right, time to get a lawyer and figure out what my options are. I reach out to a lawyer on January 2nd. They set time with me to get on the phone the following week, because obviously it's a holiday and people are out of office. On that Tuesday, when we were set to have a call, it gets postponed because the LA fires break out. Emma says in her video that I capitalized on other people's trauma to benefit me and how I was painted in the situation. Here's a view of the fire from where I was at. And here's a picture of me shoving all of my most important belongings, my childhood books and stuffed animals, my cat's ashes into a suitcase to evacuate immediately like the rest of my neighborhood.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can blame Chloe for not replying during like the evacuation process and trying to figure out where she's going to be staying. I can't even begin to imagine how stressful that situation must have been. Now, to add some context as to what Emma said in her video regarding this, in case you forgot, Emma said that the conversation about her leaving and not receiving a reply back from Chloe started a few days before the fires and then ended up going on for about 25 days, I believe. 25 days without receiving a reply from Chloe specifically. Now, Chloe actually goes on a show that she was removed from like this Canva account during the evacuation process.
Here is a screenshot of while I am working out where I'm going with my friends. You can see at the top, it says that I've been removed from Emma Klipstein's Canva team. While I'm evacuating, she is actively removing me from things and also sending me an email the day of where there is no ask of like, hey, are you okay? I saw what's going on. I'm sure you need some time to figure things out. Get back to me on this when you can. None of that. Just a demand to get back to her. She says it's been 5 days since her initial email that she sent on Friday, January 3rd. This was 3 days into the work week after a holiday and on the day of a mass evacuation.
Yeah, so reading through this email, which Chloe says was the day that she had evacuated, it says, Chloe, it has been 5 days since I sent this email. I would appreciate a response before we engage with brands, alluding to disarray in our internal affairs. So the context of this, from Emma's point of view, was that Chloe was ignoring messages to Emma, but then replying to brands on their company's behalf and maybe like alluding to the fact that they've got some problems going on. I also find the increase in engagement with our audience from your personal account in the broadcast channel and the the recent personal tags you've added to your reels without responding to me to be extremely unprofessional and clearly self-promoting. We need to prioritize getting a plan in place regardless of the direction we take. And now at this point we hear some more details of when Chloe was locked out of the account. So if you remember in Emma's video, she said that she was the first person to lock Chloe out of the accounts and sent her an email basically saying like, you're not replying to me, so I've took some of the accounts, so if we can sort this out, I can send over the passwords.
I never told anyone to follow me. She then claims that she locked me out of the accounts because of, quote, unauthorized posts. Not only is it literally impossible for me to be unauthorized to post, but the posts that were going up were 2 days before the TikTok ban on TikTok. It was normal content, and it was asking followers to migrate to Instagram. That way, there was still an audience that existed if TikTok didn't. So the next day, on January 17th, I wake up to this email.
Now at this point, we start hearing some new details around the time that Emma started her own podcast. So Chloe talks about how Emma started a podcast, and in that podcast, she said she's been working on this for about 7 months. And then Chloe shows an email from 4 months before Emma started her podcast, basically saying that Emma has stopped working as much on the company.
Then we get to January 23rd. This was the day that she launched her podcast, Too Much. I was blocked from that account from the get-go, so I had no idea about it until people started texting me. Here's a screenshot of the transcript from her first episode. This is where it gets really interesting. She says that she started working on her podcast 7 months ago. She says, 7 months ago, I started ideating and evolving the podcast. So 7 months from the launch date of January 23rd would have been June 23rd of 2024. Here's an email that I sent in September where I am begging her to do more work. And it literally states that I started doing majority of the work on June 20th of 2024. It says, we set a deadline today for brand, and I wound up having to cut all of the clips by myself, even though this was your ad read. I've handled emails with brand, manager, brand, and more. If you look in our sent box, I have handled the majority of them for the last 3 weeks. I've created and posted 8 out of 10 of the filler graphics on the feed since June 20th. One of the 2 that you made was one we worked on together that I also posted, and it just goes on and on. It says at the beginning, I'm doing my best to get as much done as I can without your full support.
Okay, so clearly you can see Chloe's point is here is that the workload wasn't split 50-50. And in fact, around the time that Emma says she started like eyeing up this podcast and thinking about it, Chloe believes that Emma stopped working as much and Chloe was doing a lot more of the work. Now, I will say this transcript of Emma's podcast, it says, I stopped apologizing for being too much. I've been ideating on this podcast for probably the last 7 months and it has evolved so many times. At first, I thought my fault was I've had a lot of relationships. I've broken up with a lot of people I've been broken up with. I'm going to talk about that. And then I thought that's not really too far of a departure from my previous venture, Unhinged. And then goes on to say, so then it pivoted again. Now, what I will say is like reading this, it doesn't necessarily look to me that Emma's saying like I was like fully working on this podcast for the past 7 months. It almost seems like she was just like thinking about it and thinking about what it could be, which I do think are 2 very different things, but obviously we don't know what the truth is there. Emma might have been working on the podcast fully throughout that 7 months, and that might have resulted in her not putting as much time into their podcast together. That might have happened. Again, we don't know. Like I said, I'm not sure what the thought process was, but I do think there is a difference between like thinking about maybe starting a podcast and like briefly thinking about some ideas of what that podcast could be because you're unhappy at your current business compared to actually like working behind the scenes fully on this podcast, getting a team together and making sure like it can launch. Again, not sure which one is true, but just putting that out there. Now, of course, in Emma's video, we heard a lot about how this was a 50-50 partnership. Everything should be split down the middle. Now, Chloe goes on to give her thoughts on this and says it wasn't 50-50.
Here's the thing about her claim to an implied partnership, which I deny because we operated under separate LLCs with a clear intention to maintain distinct business entities. But even if there was an implied partnership, which again I deny, her choice to stop doing 50% of the workload to work on a competing business behind her partner's back would have materially breached it. It would have breached it by maybe breach of fiduciary duty, breach of duty of good faith, constructive abandonment. There is no implied partnership. There was no implied partnership. Mind you, she was collecting 50% of the revenue with no problem. And after my lawyer called this out, she tried to go back on that in her newer episode, saying that she had just started working on it in recent weeks.
Yeah, so you can see Chloe's responses. You weren't working as hard on this channel anymore, so you could create a competing business, which would go against like an implied partnership. And I think it's pretty obvious, right? They've got two very different sides of the story. It's pretty much impossible to know, like, who put work in at what points. Obviously, we're going to hear two very different sides. We have been hearing two very different sides. It's more of a case of what do you think based on the information that we have been given from both sides. When it's tricky when you've got one side saying that was a 50-50 partnership and one side saying the complete opposite. Now, at this point in the timeline, we're at the time when Emma took control of some of the accounts, one of which being Spotify, and we see more of what Emma did with the Spotify accounts, like she erased the Spotify accounts, basically took away the picture and whatnot, left one episode up as well, which was clearly, seemingly, a message to Chloe.
So here's an email that I received from Spotify. A lot of it's redacted because we are very much in a legal situation. But as you can see, it says, currently, we understand at this time that you are the owner of the account. And you may be wondering why the subject line at the top says, Unbothered Podcast, hacked evidence and follow-up. Here's the next receipt. This is a snippet from a cease and desist that my lawyers sent to her. This was sent to her because my podcast was unlawfully accessed by Emma and taken down while it was charting. She removed the thumbnail, she deleted the name, she removed all of the content that we had, and she left up one episode that was titled Play Stupid Games, Win Stupid Prizes. This was done while we were in the middle of legal negotiations for a settlement. She decided this was a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I said it in the last video. In my opinion, I don't think this was a good idea. And I think clearly from the outcome of it all, it wasn't a good idea because we've seen what's happened since. I mean, especially now hearing that one episode was left up that says, like, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. It does seem like more of, like, a personal dig rather than just, like, securing the account just because these negotiations aren't, like, working. She's not receiving replies. Chloe again mentions that Emma wanted 250k for this and says, like, you're literally devaluing the company whilst you're claiming you should be owed 250k.
The workload was still collecting 50% of revenue, then decides to quit because I asked for an apology, which, by the way, the first episode she launched is called I'm Done Apologizing. Then demands $250,000 for a brand that she's also actively doing her best to devalue. Deleting from Spotify, smearing online. Like, not only does this money not exist, but why are you doing your best to ruin the brand and the person that is supposed to supposedly pay you?
Yeah, I mean, judging from what we're hearing, and if the finance situation is true that we heard from at the beginning of this podcast, it seems like Emma probably knew she wasn't going to get 250k, because if there isn't 250k available, how are you going to get it? It seems to me that Emma just more so thinks that they should have created new podcasts and went on their own journey with new accounts instead of using the Unhinged podcast, which already had a following. Chloe then goes on to show a cease and desist that she'd received from Emma's lawyer, which says that Emma is requesting to be removed from any of the content that's on the Spotify account and other socials. And also they wanted the name change, to which Chloe says that she didn't sign the cease and desist, but she did it anyways.
On February 12th, I receive a cease and desist from her lawyer. Here are some snippets. While Emma claims to have been erased from everything, this document specifically requests any removal of content with her in it and a cease and desist to use the name Unhinged. To be clear, I did not sign her document, but I respected those demands.
And then Chloe ends the podcast by saying it didn't need to go the way that it has. It didn't need to be handled the way that it has.
All things considered, this never had to become what it is. It could have been a clean break. It could have been a clean settlement. It could have been handled privately. It could have been handled respectfully. But I am done with it now, and I hope this is the last time that I have to talk about it.
And that is pretty much the full response. So we have, like, we kind of did already have both sides of the story, right? Because there was videos from both people in the last episode, but this is, like, more of both sides of the story, right? We've got a long-form podcast from Emma and a long-form podcast from Chloe, and I would love to know your opinions in the comment section down below. I think to me, it seems like there's definitely errors on both sides, right? And there's a lot of stuff in there that we just wouldn't know unless we were there, right? Especially to do with, like, the workloads and whatnot, and there'll be a lot of conversations that happened off camera that we just wouldn't have seen. In terms of the actual business and the ownership, I guess it's going to be played out legally, and we'll see what the outcome is going to be there, right? Again, not a lawyer, so I'm not really sure how that's going to play out, but it looks like we are going to get an answer about that eventually. And who knows, this might result in another response from Emma. I've checked, and it doesn't seem like Emma's posted anything about this since. It is a new video, so maybe there is something coming, who knows? But again, I would love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you did enjoy the video, please do leave a like on it, subscribe if you are new. Also, if you're interested in any other content, me and Emily have a channel where we, like, play games, we react to some reality shows. We're currently reacting through this, like, murder mystery show from back in, like, 2013. And yeah, if that is something that interests you, then that'll be linked in the description as well. And until the next one, I'll see you guys in a bit. Alright, goodbye.